Welcome to today's Shared Experience webinar, Operation Reset. I think it's been clear that post the initial impact of the pandemic, the new normal for the NHS would not simply involve going back to the way things were. And now we've certainly got initiatives and rhetoric from some of the key bodies that are starting to shape this. So as communicators, we need to assess what elements of health services will be rebooted in a different format to the one our sector is perhaps used to, and therefore how we adapt to that. So I'm delighted to introduce Zoe Bedford, who is the CEO of ZPB Associates, who's actually been integral in bringing together today's panel and is going to chair what I know is going to be a very enlightening discussion, as well as generously sharing some of ZPB's proprietary qualitative research insights. So let me hand over now to Zoe to introduce our other panelists.
Hello everybody, as Mike has said, I'm Zoe Bedford and I'm the Chief Executive of ZPB. Really, first of all, Mike, thanks so much to you for hosting us today and to Romilly for helping pull all this together. And of course to our panellists who have given up a lot of time to prepare for this. As Mike said, I run a consultancy called ZPB, and we set this up about 10 years ago, and it was really with the mission of trying to improve partnerships and collaboration between different parts of the healthcare system, and to make sure that every conversation and interaction that we have is a positive one. And we see our kind of primary job as building an environment or those opportunities where the NHS, technology firms, pharma and life sciences can have those sort of better connected and more productive partnerships. And our aim is to try and create those opportunities that allow good things to happen, change to happen, which is ultimately going to improve the way that care is delivered and consumed in the UK. So I don't want to spend very much time talking, you'll be pleased to hear, because actually we've got some very, very interesting people to hear from today. But I am very conscious that most people around here will have heard of Novartis. They will certainly have heard of Genomics England, and most people probably would have heard of the Digital Healthcare Council. So what qualifies me to be hosting this session today? So I'm going to just throw up a couple of slides, which I hope you can all see. So these are some of the organisations that we work with. We work across three key sectors in the healthcare market: service providers, tech and digital companies, and pharma and life sciences. Largely independent sector organisations, but we also do a really crucial amount of work with NHS and public sector and third sector. And what that does is it gives us a sort of all-important insight into what makes the market and the system over here tick. Here are some of the places that you'll find us, she says, not being able to move her things. So we work not just with the healthcare system, but we work within it as well. So we sit on a number of boards and committees and councils, which again kind of really allows us to understand what's happening from within. And what it also does is it means we get to work with some really quite extraordinary people and brains, three of whom I'm delighted are joining us here today. So let me introduce our panel. So Graham Kendall, Graham, do you want to give a wave so everyone knows who you are? There we go. Graham is a man with many hats, and today he's joining us as the director of the Digital Healthcare Council, which is the first trade association that represents the UK's leading digital health providers. So these are organisations who are providing or partnering with organisations that provide clinical and non-clinical services through technology. He's also been heavily involved with the NHS Confederation and other NHS associations for well over a decade, and I think probably, Graham, that's where you and I first met. He advises the Department of Health, NHS Trust, charities, independent sector, and also Graham is a secret geek, a data geek, and is behind some of the modelling that NHS Confederation providers have been using recently to understand some of the longer term impact of the pandemic. And I am hoping that Graham is going to be sharing some of that with us in due course. Parker, do you want to show your hand? Who looks like he's in the office. So Parker is the Chief Commercial Officer of Genomics England, and he's definitely in the office unless he's rebranded his sitting room. He is one of life's great enthusiasts. It wouldn't surprise me if you have done that. as well as being at Genomics England, Parker sits on the board of Council of Research UK. He sits on Matt Hancock's Tech Advisory Board. He's been the CTO of Great Ormond Street, of Virgin Care. He was the entrepreneur in residence of the world's largest venture capital fund, which is Fidelity 8 Roads. And whilst there, he invested in some of the most exciting and innovative tech and data analytics startups. And then finally, but not least at all, is Samuel Hollis, who is at Novartis. He's a member of their pharma executive committee at Novartis and has had a long and very successful career. I run over that bit long, Samuel, because I'm always conscious that people might think, oh, it's not been that long. He's had an extensive career in cardiovascular and respiratory. Really excited that Samuel's joined us, because Novartis is often referred to as one of the most innovative pharma companies and has a particular reputation in the UK as being very innovative and forward-thinking and collaborative in its approach to partnering with NHS, both centrally and locally. And so I'm really excited to learn and hear from Samuel about what he's observed and witnessed over the last few months with regards to NHS's openness and willingness to collaborate with industry. So that's our panel. I'm going to very quickly talk us through some of the recent findings of some research that we've done. Now, as Mike mentioned, we've done some qualitative research. Those of you who are looking for some charts and graphs and lots of data and spreadsheets, you're going to be sorely disappointed, I'm afraid. What we've done is over June and July, we interviewed a number of system leaders, and what we did is, rather than do a huge quant survey, of which there's plenty of stuff out there, we just did a series of 15 in-depth interviews with key leaders from across NHS, pharma, digital, tech and data, and crucially academia as well. And by leaders, I mean the people that we were talking to, their C-suite, their senior clinicians, they were policymakers, they were people who are literally right in the midst of things within NHS X and NHS England as and when the pandemic was evolving. And we did this because we were really keen to understand what, if any good, could come out of the last 6 devastating months. And as we all know, the old cliche of sort of evolution, innovation, change is always born out of necessity. So the question that we sort of have been looking at is where have we seen positive developments emerge, and what should we try and capture and preserve as systems start to reset? And hopefully those of you who've joined us and work in global positions, you'll see there are some similarities in this market which actually will start to emerge in others as well. So the first thing that we found was that unanimous agreement from everybody that we spoke to and continue to speak to is that the public sector alone cannot solve all the challenges. Very, very clear that industry, life sciences and academia need to be let in. Real clear examples of where universities, for example, really helped fill some of the backlog with shortage of clinical staff. Collaboration has never been more important than ever. And what we saw and what we heard, and in fact something that Parker said to me just yesterday, I think it was, is that there was this huge sort of rush to collaborate and offer support and help. And NHS England kind of got a bit overwhelmed about it. So in the first few weeks, there were over 1,000 offers for ventilators, over 2,000 inquiries about offering support for PPE equipment. The NHS was so overwhelmed that it set up mailboxes and dedicated helplines and phone lines just to deal with that. And we'll come on to a little bit about actually whether that was or wasn't helpful. But the public sector alone can't solve all these challenges, and we're really seeing that happen and trickle down at a local level as well. Second thing that came out is that there's been a real positive development around collaborative working across boundaries. So this isn't just about different parts of the sector collaborating, this is about different teams and different ways of working. And this collaborative working actually was born out of people just being told to get on with the job rather than look up the chain of command. And that has been a real change. So we've seen a huge shift towards clinical leadership, which, as we we know there's been a lot of talk about, and people have talked about it a lot. But when the NHS was actually truly responding, it was the clinical teams that had to very, very quickly shift and change the way that was being working. Notably, the panel felt it was really important that the involvement from the commercial sector remained, and that was actually deemed as a necessity. Third thing, so quite often in all of this, digital health and technology was seen as a bit of a panacea or a silver bullet that was going to enable this new collaboration and this more productive way of working. But actually, and I'm fairly sure this is something that Graham will want to talk to later, it's probably too early to tell whether there has actually been a true digital transformation. Certainly the rhetoric suggests that there has been, but recent GP data, for example, showed that online GP consultations have actually gone down, not up, and actually telephone consultations have gone up. And telephone consultations isn't a digital innovation. The other thing which actually came across quite strongly from the panelists is that we don't really have any accurate data around this, and there's not sort of a single source of truth. So we simply don't know the extent to which digital health and online and virtual access is going to, how much of it's going to stay and how sustained it's going to be. And I think that's quite interesting, because for pharma companies and private providers who are investing very heavily in technology, we just need to think really carefully as to the extent to which information and access to healthcare is being democratized in that sense. The other thing that we learned, and those who've been working in healthcare a while will go, well, there's nothing new here, surely, which is that the hospital can't be the centre of healthcare. We need integration, plurality of provision, better integrated care, and local authorities, of course, need to be part of the solution. We've also seen one of the sort of rising stars of all of this has been community services, which quite often have been overlooked or get classified as a Cinderella service. But actually, community services have really stepped up and is showing true becoming some of the leaders within integrated care systems, have been absolutely critical to helping respond and reset post-COVID. So yes, nothing new here, you may think, and certainly as I've been working in healthcare for around 18 years, and this has always been the plan, that hospitals weren't going to be the centre of everything. But this does feel a little bit different. And again, all of our panel felt that they were witnessing this happen at a pace and scale that has not happened before. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with integrated care systems and STPs, and I'm not going to bore you with an anatomy lesson on the NHS. But we are moving from a system of over 200 CCGs, or it's under 100 now, but under that now, but many CCGs into far fewer integrated care systems, which are then going to be managed by 7 regional authorities, which have all got their own P&Ls. This is important. It's, in fact, it's essential for anyone who's sort of trying to work with the NHS, because we're going to have to very quickly identify what those regional priorities are, because there's a lot of change. They've all got their own set of priorities and quite a lot of autonomy. It's going to require a bit of a rethink, I think, from industry about who their customers and who their stakeholders are and how they engage with them and what they engage them about. And as I said earlier, there are some new groups emerging, which I think previously marketers and comms people have perhaps overlooked. The other thing which came out quite strongly is about the opportunity to rethink value. So there has been a kind of a new, and I'm going to sort of put it in quotes, temporary definition of value. And this you see across a number of different, in a number of different ways. So we have seen access to certain higher cost therapies being expanded. We've seen a number of changes in the way that people have been able to access care. New treatments have come on. The panelists, again, all felt that they'd seen greater creativity and acceptance for new things, and also had seen a lot of their NHS counterparts starting to think a lot more laterally about where else they need to be driving value. When we dug into this a little bit, they felt that there was probably more opportunity now than ever before to really think through around value and get people to think beyond just the cost of the drug or the cost of the treatment. And again, that's partly being drawn by this drive to move into integrated care systems, where we have a single budget across a whole health economy. So almost all of our interviewees identified with this challenge of moving the conversation away from price and cost and moving towards value. It's a really difficult thing. We know that pharma have been talking to NHS about this for decades. But again, it just feels like we're in a bit of a moment of time that we can do that. So all of this, I think, means that marketers and comms people need to take another look at the value proposition. So where is it actually that we're driving value into the system? What is it beyond what we're currently saying? Where else can we bring value? Where are we contributing? And it's really crucial, this bit, because it's more than just about a sort of a list of benefits or product features. We've really got to understand this through the eyes of the healthcare system. And this is a very, very, very quick overview around what the key priorities are within the health system at the moment as we move towards winter and over the next few months. So again, this is something I believe we'll be discussing a little bit more with our panelists, but we know there's a very significant backlog, both of elective procedures and delayed referrals and delayed appointments. So any kind of organisations need to really think through about how their service or platform or intervention or treatment really reduces the use for physical intervention. How's it driving more throughput? Does it reduce burden on physical services? And we need to make sure that we're actually better evidencing that, so that when we're talking to people within the NHS, they can see where the systemic value is rather than just that short moment in time. Second thing is that winter is coming, which, as we know, is always a bit of a pinch point in the healthcare system. So anything which is looking, the NHS is very, very focused at the moment on extending and expanding safe supported discharge into the communities and at homes, keeping care closer to home, reducing follow-ups and readmissions, reducing length of stay. The other interesting thing, the third thing, which comes out very, very strongly in the NHS England's recent directive around the key priorities for phase 3, is the need to protect and support staff. So the NHS has traditionally not had a very good rep when it comes to supporting its staff. We know there's over 100,000 vacancies pre-COVID. 40% of clinicians reported having to take time off for stress or work-related anxiety. A lot of people felt that the people plan, the much long-awaited people plan, was a little bit underwhelming when that was published. But COVID's put clinical leadership right in the spotlight, and frankly, it shone. And one of the key focal areas for NHS's phase 3 is around protecting, supporting and safeguarding staff. And I think the reason why I put so much emphasis on this is that when we're thinking about our products or our services or our organisations or our value proposition, it's very tempting to look at it through sort of relatively blinkered or in a sort of quite a sort of one or two dimensional way. But actually, when you're looking at thinking what these pressures are, what's causing that stress and anxiety within the workforce, you'll start looking at where else we can add some value, where else we can start messaging and focusing around what is it that we can do to support that imperative for the health system. Fourth thing is around working as systems of care. As I said, during COVID itself, hospitals grouped together, community primary care, and acute providers and the private sector rapidly reorganise themselves into systems of care. And that is crucially what stopped the hospital sector from being completely overwhelmed. And this has continued post-peak. Now many of these systems are continuing to work in that way as the NHS prepares for the winter. So we're seeing high volume surgical hubs emerge. We're seeing a lot of virtual outpatient clinics, more community services. So again, thinking about where else we can add value and drive more efficiency or productivity or greater access or better experience across the whole system of care is absolutely crucial. And then the final thing is around inequality and discrimination. And this is, I think, quite often an overlooked consideration. The NHS has an imperative to reduce the social and ethnic discrimination, and very clear and very specific and quite stretchy targets have been set of it to deliver within the next 6 months around proving that they're delivering better and equal access to services and treatments for the AME communities. And again, thinking about, well, if you pull all these 5 threads together and then think about, well, what does that mean? How can we add value to that? How do we position ourselves in the context of these 5 priorities? That, I think, is what's going to really kind of drive forward and change things for us as organisations who are trying to work with the NHS, and also really help cement what we're starting to see around better collaboration and a willingness to work more creatively with the different parts of the healthcare system. So I've talked too long. I'm going to close with this one. The key takeaways, I think, for everybody at this point are got to think in terms of systems, not institutions. Think in terms of people and populations, not just organisations. Crucially, you've got to identify what that common goal is across that whole system and where you fit within that, and then really communicate that really strongly. Understand that the dynamics have changed, look at the value proposition, change that messaging, and crucially map where that influence lies, because that's going to be very different according to the different areas and regions that we're working with. I'd really encourage people to think more broadly about where product or service drives value, and crucially who it drives value for. So yes, it might be that the end beneficiary is a patient, but if a patient who's having a better experience, who's got fewer complications, is less likely to bounce back into acute or specialist care, that's also improving the experience of other people working across that system. So think a little bit more broadly around that. And the final point is about, there's without a doubt, I think, and this I think has come up quite strongly again in our research and in lots of subsequent conversations that I've had, is there is a new acceptance among patients and healthcare practitioners and systems to do things differently. So lean into that. And I believe that this was my final thing. This is not from our research, this is my own personal observation. I actually think it's never been a better time to be a communicator, because there is so much stuff to be going on and it makes it very interesting, and we've got to be able to cut through on all of this. So enough from me, and what I'd like to do is to hand over to Graham at this point. So Graham, as in that very, very quick whistle-stop tour as to what's going on in some of the system and what some of the findings have been, we've seen a lot of sort of positive developments, but we've also seen some of our research and some of our panelists felt that there'd been some slightly worrying developments in technology. And I wanted to come to this bit first. Do you recognise this? Is this something that you've witnessed around digital health and tech?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of really interesting things there. First of all, there's a narrative that everything has changed, and it's changed incredibly quickly, and depending on who you talk to, we've done 4 years working 4 weeks, 5 years in 5 weeks. There's been a big transformation, and it's certainly true, I would say, that there's been a big cultural shift and an acceptance that we can do things. But then one of the really interesting questions is, okay, so how much has this actually translated in practice? I've seen a lot of figures thrown around in terms of just simply video consultations, so moving from face-to-face to video. But we've also seen the official figures in GP appointment data, and they just don't match this up, bear this out at all. So the figures actually in the official GP appointment data are so wrong that, frankly, I don't believe them, because we're talking at national level figures that are smaller than individual companies that are DHC members. So they just don't make sense. Now, there are various hypotheses that I'm not going to kind of bog you down with about why this is wrong, but I think it's all about the collection of data and the systems that are being used. So basically the AMRs, whether it's TPP, Vision, how they report online data. I think we can probably trust the total appointment figures because well, there are various reasons why I think they're probably reasonably reliable. But even those are a bit challenging, because if you begin a consultation in one medium and then you change and move to another, that can count as different numbers of appointments, so clarification's been issued on that. But broadly speaking, I think the total numbers are probably realistic. But actually what is happening is really hard to discern in practice. So we know individual providers who have worked with and partnered with organizations, they've reported figures themselves, but that's a snapshot. We know the official data is just completely off in terms of online consultations. And we also know that the centre is collecting information, but it's not really publishing that in a systematic form. And the figures that do come out are things like 80% of practices have access to online consultations, not are using them, and no indication of, even if they are using them, how many patients are using them. So all of that and the rich sort of information that you get about how patients experience this is only really available in snapshots by looking at things that the providers themselves publish. So I think it's really important, if we're to learn what's working and what's not working, it's really important that we start to collect and publish that data. Yeah, so there's a lot that we can drill into there, but fundamentally, my view is that, I've worked in information long enough to know that we all have ideas about what's going on, and when you actually stress the data and see whether that's reflected in reality, or whether you can get evidence to support or challenge that, normally you find something that is more nuanced, more interesting, and different from what your original hypothesis is. And unless you really go through the discipline of working the data, you are, one of my favorite quotes is Gene Kranz, who was the mission control director of the Apollo 13 mission. When it all goes wrong and the Apollo mission is literally exploding on the way to the moon, his immediate point is, let's work the problem. Let's not make things worse by guessing. And if we're not willing to really look at what's going on and collect that information and scrutinize it and make it public, then we are in danger of coming to an incorrect diagnosis. And every clinician knows, if you've got an incorrect diagnosis, you'll have probably an incorrect solution.
So on that point then about, unless you know what the problem is, you're only going to make it worse. You've been doing some work, I know from our previous conversations, around what's actually going on within the system, where some of the pressure points might be, how catastrophic that those pressure points might be. And I think you've got something you can share with us on that. So can I ask you to talk everybody through some of this, because I think that's a really key point, which is there is a lot of noise out there in the system at the moment, and it is so important to be able to really drill down and identify those, because I think there is always a temptation just to sort of see the NHS and the healthcare system as a single payer system, and it's far more nuanced than that.
It is indeed. So I'll just share my screen, and hopefully we can go from here. So you should see, you're seeing the slide just that's coming up. Yeah. Okay. So the key thing here, I've looked at just a few data points. There are many we can get into. Some of the most easily accessible data points are around waiting times, and this is waiting for referrals into secondary care. So there's a lot that the NHS does that's not covered by this, but this just gives an indication of where we are. As I'm sure everybody knows who's on this call, there's a commitment that 92% of people waiting should begin their treatment within 18 weeks. Well, since COVID, no CCG is meeting that at all. Not surprising and fully understandable, but nevertheless, that has gone out of window. In fact, almost half of the current official waiting list are waiting over 18 weeks now. It's quite stunning. Getting up for, oh, and by the way, these are based on data that was released last month. The next data release is actually tomorrow. So this is the best that we know, but I'm expecting things to be considerably worse when we have the figures for tomorrow. So yeah, I'm expecting by tomorrow we will see that well over 1 million people are waiting at least half a year, and that's just to begin their treatment. That's not for the treatment to complete. And I as you mentioned, Zoe, I did some work at the outset of COVID, which was kind of modeling, well, essentially waiting numbers are a bit like running a bath. However much is waiting to go out is a product of how fast things are flowing in, how fast things are flowing out. In the case of waiting, it's patients flowing in and out of the system. And there are so many patients who join the waiting list each month that if you start to restrict the flow out, which is essentially what we're doing by pausing all activity, and now trying to get it back on track, but at a slower pace due to infection control and staff availability and all of those issues, the numbers will go up quite rapidly. There's an extra nuance to this, which is that we actually saw a massive drop off in the number of referrals. So the waiting numbers have gone down. But if you were to tot up the numbers that we would typically expect over the period that we've had COVID, you'd have expected another 3.5 million people to have presented. So we're already probably looking, like, if you assume that about 85% of those will eventually show up, we're already looking at a total waiting list of around 6.5 million compared to the official 4 million, assuming that those people eventually show up at the GPs. And of course, some of them will have relatively minor conditions, but others will have really serious conditions and they will have waited quite a while. So there's a big issue there around delayed treatments and problems with care, but just modeling the basic numbers, not factoring in any extra work for delayed treatment, I think we're looking at probably around 10 million by the end of the year on the list, and we're waiting for a long time. Now, if the phase 3 targets that were announced end of July in the letter to the service are met, then you could probably contain it about 7.5 million. But as the Spartans said, if that's a very big if. So looking at what this just drilling down a little bit more, the reset target is essentially that we're supposed to be delivering between 70% in August, rising steadily to 90% of last year's elective activity. That's just day case, that's not inpatient. So, but that's a big challenge if you consider that over the period for which we do have data, we're running at about 34% of admitted and about 62% of non-admitted rates. So we've
Can
got
I just at this point, just so that everyone who's not totally so familiar with the NHS Reset program, one of the targets is that all elective and outpatients the back has got to be cleared, got to be operating at about 90% pre-COVID levels. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
70%, but by November or by winter, as it's known, it's got to be at 90%, which is quite a tall order.
It's a very tall order.
Restrictions that people are currently working within.
All of that and all of the challenges around, a potential second wave, the flare-ups that we've seen over the past few days. That's really tough, and some of the terms that have been used by people anonymously to describe those targets are colourful, to say the least. I think mad is probably the most concise. Indeed. So So it's going to be challenging, but these are aspirational targets. If we don't aim high, it's important to try to tackle it. And I think this graph shows really why it's so important, because personally, I think the headline figure of the number of people waiting is a little bit off the point to some extent. It doesn't matter if the whole population is waiting, if we're only waiting for a couple of days. It's how long you're waiting that really matters. So what you're seeing here, the orange line, is how long people were waiting a year ago. So you'd expect, can you see my mouse, by the way, because I'm waving it now? Yeah. So you'd expect, there's a bit of a drop off here just before 18 weeks, which is where the target is. But essentially, people are largely being treated, and then you've got this tail. The blue line is how long people were waiting at the end of June this year. So, a big fall off, which reflects just a massive drop off in the number of people who are coming through. But then this huge peak here that has moved considerably. That's 5-6 weeks later, and this every week, this wave is moving further to the right. But what we're also seeing now is, if I'd drawn this a couple of months earlier, you'd have seen this start very low. So you're getting this second wave, which is all the people who are returning into care. And bear in mind, again, this is just elective provision. A huge amount of the services activity is dealt with managing conditions. It's dealt with people after they've begun this process and doing their ongoing care and follow-up. So this is where the media have focused on the number of people who are waiting over a year, and yes, that has risen dramatically. But this, to me, is the wave that's coming down the line, and that'll have to be tackled a lot at a reduced throughput, alongside a much, I'd expect in the next few months that this figure right at the beginning of the x-axis, the people who are entering care, is going to soar up to about here as all those people who haven't showed up over the course of COVID start to turn up and get referred in. That's if we do things as normal. So, what this tells me is that we just can't continue to do things as normal. And bear in mind, this is just elective activity. So that's, I find that really scares me, that graph, frankly. For background, this is private activity, so this is fin data. These are private pay patients, either treated by private providers or by NHS private patient units. And you'll see, again, there's a very similar drop-off, though what this doesn't show is that a lot of activity that was done in private providers was the private providers it wasn't that they weren't doing anything at this point. They were acting as a kind of cold supply, COVID-free supply to the NHS as part of the deal. So private volumes have plummeted. But what you'll see here, and what's I think really interesting, is that the one area that maintained almost maintained its activity is oncology going through in private provision. So it's dropped off a bit, but it's largely where you would expect. But as a share of the private market, it grew considerably. So there's some oncology care there, and of course there's been a lot of attention into how do we respond to these really urgent and literally life-threatening conditions quickly. So this is where the NHS oncology figures come in. And this is just, again, it's 2-week waiting figures. Actually, the bottom graph is probably the most is logical place to start. So here you can see the volume of, there's a commitment to treat any cancer, for those who aren't familiar, a commitment to begin the treatment, or at least begin to see patients who have suspected cancer within 2 weeks. And as you can see, this is the total seen on a monthly basis over the course of the past 4 years. It's been rising pretty much in a linear fashion, and then suddenly we've got this massive drop off here. And this just focuses on the past 12 months, looking at year-on-year change as a percentage. So 0 is what it was last year, and you can see basically it plummets to a drop-off of 60%. But we're still not back, as of June, to the levels at which we would be. And to catch up for all these missing patients, we'd have to be kind of rising to here, pretty quickly. So clearly, this is where the service is focusing. It's really important to identify these patients. Not all are presenting at GPs. Volumes are still down at GPs, although the latest figures seem to be suggesting that those are coming back up. But we've had fewer patients presenting with cancer than we would expect. We've had fewer patients presenting with stroke. These are conditions that are not things that might be affected by day-to-day work and being in lockdown, and therefore not being exposed to potential accidents, trauma. These are things that there's no reason to believe that these patients are not out there, and it's a big concern. So that kind of gets us to where we, what do we do about it? And part of the phase.
Yep. Graham, I'm really sorry. I'm going to hurry you along, okay?
Sorry.
I don't know how many slides you've got, but I'm quite keen to bring the others in.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so basically what this shows is variation at GP appointment level. So you can see, you can click on, we can share the links and you can click on the things, but you see basically the ones that are dark red are ones where GP appointments are really low. The lowest is around 50% of activity this time last year. The ones that are dark green are the ones where we've more or less got back to normal activity. But you'll see there's a really huge amount of variation, and the lesson for me is that the ones that have entered into kind of partnership working with the local with digital providers and really try to focus and model that are the ones that have managed to maintain overall levels of appointments. So if we want to keep that service ticking over, you need to really focus in on what you're doing, and that's the whole solution as a whole.
Can I just ask a question on that?
Sure.
Is there any evidence? Is it possible yet to map that data around access to GP appointments, and then where we're seeing the greatest backlog within acute care? Is there any correlation? Are we able to see that yet?
Okay, so what we can see,
basically, are we starting to see yet where there's been a drop in primary care consultations and GP appointments, whether that's now bouncing, having a longer term impact on acute care?
Okay, so yes, you can see a fairly good correlation between a drop in GP appointments and the numbers of referrals going into acute care. Of course, the perverse thing is that if your patients are coming in and going down, it's easier for you to tackle your the patients that you do have on your waiting list. But that's only a kind of, that's the calm before the storm, because when those patients start to turn up again, then you get deluge. So we haven't seen that deluge of patients coming in that are overwhelming activity, but what we do see is a pretty strong correlation between activity at GP level and referrals. And it's a much stronger correlation, and this is, I think, a bit of a statistical kind of artifact to some extent. There's a stronger correlation during COVID between GP activity and referral volumes than you would get throughout the year, but that's, I think, due to seasonal variation and things like that. Okay,
thank you very much. Parker, I'm gonna come to you next, if that's okay, because I know you as I said, your career has been very much sort of at the point where health, life sciences and technology and services and providers come together. And what I was just interested to hear from you is about whether you have seen more the extent to which you've seen or encouraged by the collaboration between those different parts of the sector, and what you're seeing at GEL. So we've heard from Graham around a little bit around digital healthcare, but actually we've seen about what's now happening operationally at a very local level within the NHS. Now looking to your part of the system, I suppose, what are you seeing there, and what steps or changes have you seen?
Sure. So I suppose Graham's message, I think, was very sobering, because it is clearly a very strained time for patients in the system, and I think we all see how heroic both health and social care workers have been to keep up with the work that they've got. I think another group of heroic people that are less recognised are the people in drug discovery and clinical development in both pharma and academic research, who have really pulled out the stops and are working at triple time, and that's a lot more hidden from the human view. So from my seat in Genomics England, it's actually been incredibly stimulating and encouraging to see the level of collaboration between academia, industry, and healthcare. So to be specific, so Genomics England, which is the body that whole genome sequenced 100,000 participants in the UK, so we were the first country to get to 100,000 whole genomes, were challenged right at the end of March by the Department of Health and Social Care to go out and whole genome sequence 35,000 COVID patients. So that's by far the largest whole genome sequencing project in the world, and it's an outlier strategy. So we're sequencing 20,000 acutely ill people, so not just hospitalized people, but people who are on mechanical ventilation or cardiac support, and then 15,000 mild patients. And the whole purpose of this is to understand the genetic architecture behind severity, response, and susceptibility to the disease. And we're capturing not just their genetic information, but their lifetime clinical data, so primary care, secondary care, their whole cancer status. We're going to do lifetime follow-up on these patients. And in a parallel mirror project, the Sanger Institute are sequencing the viruses. So we're sequencing the hosts, and then thanks to the NHS number, we can bring host and virus together and do kind of host virus analysis as well. So that has required just a massive collaboration. And it's really kind of shown the strength of the UK system. So we're partnering with a scientific study group called Genomic, who are based out up in Scotland, and they study the genetics of intensive care conditions. And thanks to our partnership with them, we're recruiting patients out of, I think, 207 intensive care units around the country, so nearly all of them. And then we're also recruiting mild and asymptomatic patients from their homes. So we've contracted with an organization called MSS, and we're literally sending nurses to people's homes every day, sequencing to collect their blood and sequence them. And we're working with NHS Digital, who have a lot of these kind of national data sets, but not just them, also the ONS and primary care. So for the first time ever, we've got kind of fluid, near real-time access to primary care data, and we're getting that. We're pairing it with all these new patients, and we've also paired it with our 100,000 genome patients, who act as a kind of case and also a control, so we can do we can use them as a control group for the patients who are unfortunately suffering from COVID. We've had incredible levels of consent from the patient communities, and I'm glad to say that the BAME community have also been very strong in consenting. So people may know that traditionally there's a lower level of consent for all clinical trials for the BAME community, which is why, very sadly and frustratingly, the BAME community are underrepresented in genetic data sets. But we've been making a massive effort to step that up, and we are, I think, almost triply represented in the number of BAME patients we're collecting compared to the kind of national average, and we're trying to get young patients as well. So
can I ask Parker, have you seen have you seen an increase in consent since COVID, or have you always had not BAME, the BAME community? I know you've been talking about that. Have you seen that actually patients are more willing to consent to these kinds of studies now as a result of this?
I mean, we don't have a very good baseline because consenting patients out of intensive care for respiratory conditions is quite different to the normal patients who we consent, who are patients with severe cancers or parents of children with rare diseases. So I don't think we have a very good baseline. General consent terms, we've got very high levels of consent, very high willingness to share data. And then from the pharma side, we formed a consortium of tier 1 pharma companies, which I'm really pleased to say that Novartis are a member and a very active participant. And pharma have been investing time and effort and energy in helping us define the kind of ontology of the data set and the bioinformatic workflows that we're setting up so that they can use this data. The entire purpose of this exercise is to use is to get this data and use it for target discovery and clinical development purposes. And so, unlike most consortiums, we've not given any exclusivity to pharma. They're not getting any benefit or competitive advantage from this data. They're doing it purely out of a kind of a response to a kind of international crisis. So all of the data is being made to all researchers around the world at the same time. And so we've really seen people step up. We've kind of created this consortium in weeks. Would have normally taken years to do this. Illumina have been a partner of ours and have subsidized a lot of the sequencing. We're doing all of this on Amazon Web Services, who have stood up a new environment for us in record time, giving us a lot of cloud computing credits as well. So it's actually been a real testament to kind of massive kind of collaboration and pulling together and working together and just bashing through commercial, contractual, information governance, system integration barriers that would normally make things go incredibly slowly. So I found that really encouraging. And what I'm just really hoping for is that we sustain this energy level beyond the crisis and that we maintain this. And, I hope that vaccines in the future take 18 months to develop, not 18 years. And I expect that probably will be the legacy of COVID. So I've been very encouraged. I'm sorry that so many people have had to suffer in order for us to see this benefit, but there has been, like in a war, you often see the kind of best of humanity in a crisis, and I think that's certainly been true in the life sciences sector.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. And Samuel, we often hear the words flexibility and newfound energy. We've heard about agility, and again, these are things that the UK healthcare system, or indeed healthcare systems as a whole, are not universally known for, about being agile and fast and flexible. And so what I was interested to hear from you is a kind of what you have sort of personally witnessed over the last 6 months, and whether you think that you yourself have seen that flexibility and that agility, and what you think we need to do as participants in an ecosystem, and as a group of, on this particular call, a group of comms and marketers, what we can do to help sustain that. Just for you, I think it's just really, I'm just looking at the results from the poll, and over 60% of the people on this call have personally witnessed more appetite for collaboration between the NHS and industry, which is really good to see. But people have also, the same number of people, so over 60% of people have said they think it's harder now to navigate their way through the system than it was 12 months ago. So just thinking about that, if you can sort of give us some insight about what you've witnessed and experienced, and what you feel that we can do to help sustain this level that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Graham and Parker. I totally agree with that sort of the collaboration and the openness. I think that the willingness to share and collaborate is almost unprecedented. I've had 15 years in the industry and worked for a couple companies in that time, and I think that if I look at pharma and pharma collaboration, which has almost never happened, if I'm being really honest with you. If you look at the GSK and Sanofi's getting together to come together for vaccines, if you look at the AZ and Oxford University coming together for vaccine, I mean, these are things which in normal times wouldn't have happened and have, and now hopefully that kind of thinking, it continues to move on. As well as there's, actually not just sort of one company here and there, but I think there's a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation collaboration, which is working, which Novartis sits on, a number of pharma companies. And exactly as Parker said, the primary objective there is willingness to share data, but also to all work together to achieve one objective. And I think if I use that as a bit of an analogy to actually then NHS collaborations with pharma, I guess to answer your question, Zoe, I think that both pre-COVID and certainly during COVID, and hopefully coming out of it, I've seen a definite appetite or increased appetite, like your poll has said, and like your panel results has said previously, to increase that collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry, which is reassuring. But I think my observations and Novartis's observations, I think, is if we go really deep into that, I think to collaborate for the future, coming through COVID and out of it, we must be aligned on the NHS's agenda, and we must have shared objectives. Now, I know that's so obvious, but I think notoriously as an industry, we probably tried to shoehorn in our objectives into those of the NHS's, and actually, as a result, probably tarnished reputation at times, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But I think that for it to really, really work, and where we have Novartis have seen it work, is actually if we have an aligned objective, something that's, say, aligned to the NHS long-term plan at a population level, or something that's very regional or local focused, if you're looking at collaborating at a regional level, then it's much more likely to work. And it's less of a push tactic, which maybe the industry has been guilty with in the past, and much more of a let's all pull together tactic. And so I definitely, if you can align on the objective, then actually the momentum is there to continue to collaborate, NHS and pharma. And I think we've been really, really reassured by that. So that's definitely something that I hope is here to stay, to your point. I think that if I think about reputation, I think, so you and I have discussed it before, and actually I've seen a number of indexes over the last sort of couple of weeks actually, which do show that the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry has somewhat increased during COVID, which is reassuring, especially because of these collaborations and this openness of data and some of the things that Parker referenced. I think now it's the job of the pharmaceutical industry and agencies that we work alongside to ensure that we build on that momentum, we maintain the transparency and openness that hopefully we've been showing over recent months, and that continues. Because if that does, there will be further collaboration, I believe, with the NHS and other academic institutes. So that's definitely my observation. I think that in terms of as feedback for those in healthcare comms roles, I think that as a pharmaceutical company, we are certainly seeing a movement away from the transactional sell. And actually COVID has been probably a bit of an accelerator to that. Again, to your panel results, we need to be showing value to the NHS and the healthcare professionals. And I think that, so the movement away from transactional selling to one where adding value, being much more strategic about the services that we then can provide alongside our medicines is the way that this is going to go for sure. I also think there's a level of honesty which is now probably there, which has never been there before. Can I say that? Yeah. In terms of there's almost a win-win-win. So some of the conversations we're having with the NHS now is actually that it's okay to have a win-win-win, a win for the NHS, a win for the patient, and a win, dare I say, for the industry. And often that last win is sometimes not been referenced. It's kind of been, no one ever dares want to talk about the industry that will win out of this. But actually, if it is a triple win, then actually the industry is able to continue to invest and innovate. And that's what makes the whole thing sustainable. And I think that definitely we've seen a growing trend of working with the NHS to accept that if we collaborate, if we share objectives, then actually we can all have a win out of this. And most importantly, all for the patient's benefit. And so, yeah, I think they're probably my key points. And so, yeah, so for those in healthcare comms, it's to line up with that. Yeah. And then I guess probably most people will appreciate we've had this huge move towards virtual engagement. Now, you know, not just as Graham was referencing virtual consultations in the NHS, but our whole world as an industry had moved from all the education we need to provide has gone online, all of the interactions with healthcare professionals at a medical and a selling level have gone online. And actually, I think we've learned out of that we can add enormous value. And the feedback we've had from the NHS is actually that they've preferred some of the education that's been online. It's built in more flexibility, more people can attend more appropriate items, and it's just really pushed us to be much more content focused. So that's been really reassuring, and I think that's here to stay.
Yeah.
A small point on comms actually, which I think is relevant to you, which is that, I mean, clearly there's a higher noise level, and so all comms people know that, you know, to get your signal across a higher noise floor, you need to shout louder. But the other thing that's happened is that, like in a war, there's been a kind of slight concentration of power to the center. So there's been more noise and there's been fewer decision makers. So I think you need real tenacity more so than ever to get a message through. And so And the real challenge is that often these messages are at the intersection of life sciences, healthcare, and technology, which is a pretty narrow kind of cross section that not many people understand. So that's where I think the value of an organisation like ZPB, which kind of like high priest can sit across those pillars.
I've never been described as a high priest before. I like it. That's good.
It is.
But you're right. But you're right. And again, Zoe, your point earlier about there's never been a better time to be a communicator. I would agree with that on every level. I think it's that, like exactly said Parker, we need to, for appropriate comms now, to need to cut through the noise. There is so much noise out there. And actually, it's the test of the better marketeers and communicators and agencies and to actually cut through that noise. And actually, it's going to be, I'm going to say it, less about pretty images of Labradors walking on the beach with their smiling patients, and a little bit more about the quality of the content and conciseness of the content, and that is what's going to cut through the noise. It's going to be that for me anyway.
Do you think we're going to finally see an end to that sort of serify imagery that is sort of the stalwart of a lot?
No, it will never end. It will never end for sure. But I guess that, like I said, I think that the importance of the content is certainly got higher and higher and higher.
Sure. One thing I would, Parker, I always agree with you, but I don't agree with you on your point about we just have to shout louder in order to cut through, because actually I think there are a lot of people shouting very loudly. And Samuel, I don't think actually pharma is alone in shoehorning its objectives into the NHS agenda. In fact, that is something that we see across all sectors. I actually think we have, and this is why I think it's an exciting time to be in comms and marketing, I think it's all about finding something truly relevant and interesting to say. And if something's going to resonate with someone, it's because it's hyper relevant to them. It's hit a natural need. And so this comes down to that point about being really, really focused and really understanding what it is that your end user needs, or your payer or your commissioner or the clinician or whatever that might be. And it sounds really obvious, but we do have to, I think, work a little bit harder to do that now. And I do think that and I say industry as in all commercial and independent organisations. This is a gross generalisation, but we have seen, I think, in the past, a little bit of laziness about, I'm just going to shout and tell you that we're going to improve lives, reduce costs, save lives, deliver better patient experience. Well, of course, that's a basic hygiene factor now. We've got to be far more smart about what we're communicating and who we're communicating to and what value that we're driving. And as I said before, that value isn't just about the price or the cost.
And I think, just to build on that, I think I absolutely agree. I think we probably have slipped into a level of laziness. And like I said, probably all sectors, almost copy and pasting solutions from one area, just thinking, well, it will work everywhere. But I think that, as you say, I think that what I hope, and will be the future, is the industry will, and I think I count all agencies and people that work alongside the industry, we all need to become NHS experts. And that's such an easy thing to say, a harder thing to do, but we need to truly understand our customers, truly understand the systems. And to your point, so then we understand exactly what the needs are. And they won't be the same needs in different parts of the country. And we've got to be able to provide appropriate value and solutions for each of those. So if we want to continue to develop the reputation. Yeah.
One thing I'd be really interested in picking up is I believe that it's everything that you talked about so far. I'd agree with entirely. And of course, a part of that is the alignment of incentives across the different bits of the NHS jigsaw. So a big problem that I think has emerged around COVID is we've had a lot of, certainly on the digital health side, we've had a lot of frameworks, we've had a lot of things rushed through, a focus on the digital side actually on really squeezing prices down, essentially doing point commoditized solutions rather than thinking through what's the real value here. And a lot of those frameworks have not led to the sort of activity that I think, certainly the people who instigated them would have hoped for. But also more generally, a lot of energy has been put into that without very much actual utilization at the end of it. Now, my view is the reason behind that is a lack of really thinking through what works for the end users and properly empowering the end users to be able to make those decisions. So that's about getting the financial flows right, releasing the money to those users. And so there's the organizations that have been successful in both in terms of developing the business and also really crucially, getting a service that patients then use and that clinicians like and use, have been really successful in navigating all of these different moving parts and bringing them together and thinking about how the incentives work across the piece. But that's a really tough challenge. It's definitely, there's a communications element to it, there's a kind of marketing bit, but it's also about navigating the policy. And I think at a national level, we have a kind of duty to push for a simplification of this and an alignment of it, because it's been lost in the, it's really tough to navigate purely from a comms perspective, because basically there are blocks that are systemic in place. So I'm not sure, am I essentially saying I think I'm saying it's a hard thing to do. It requires a degree of subtlety and nuance in terms of the interpretation, but it means that every part of that jigsaw has to understand what the benefits are to them. And I fear that we are frustrating some of the delivery simply because those who invest and pay on one side are not necessarily the beneficiaries of the service at the end.
Yeah. I'm delighted to see that we're getting some questions coming through on the chat function here. And so I'm going to encourage, we can't see any of you incidentally, so we can just see each other. So I'm hoping that we've got some nodding heads rather than furrowed and confused brows here. But I'm very keen that we try and make this these last few minutes as interactive as possible. So please do start filling some questions. If there are particular things that you want us to discuss, consider. Just shout. Please put that through on the Q&A. What's it called? Thread. So I'm going to ask. So Ian Mullen has set us a question, and yes, quite rightly, there are definitely still parts of the system where there's some reluctance to collaborate with industry, and that reluctance isn't just within frontline NHS, that's actually at a policy level as well. So the question is there any evidence of where shifts have occurred, and any suggestions or ideas about how we might be able to break these down? So who wants to take that one? Yeah. Samuel?
I'm happy to have a start of it. I think that, yeah, I mean, I can absolutely say we've seen the improvements, and where actually we have seen success in this space. And like I said, it kind of goes back to making sure you're aligned on the objective. And you're right, not every single payer system or group is going to want to collaborate in the same way. And I think maybe that's the job then of showing the value of collaborations elsewhere. But I've certainly seen when you can align on the same objective with the NHS at a population level for population health, or even down to a local level on things that are away from maybe the pharma priority. So things that maybe around adherence, diagnosis, not just, increased use of your medicine. So I think those are some of the areas where I've seen significant traction when you can, as I said, align on the objective. In terms of evidence for that, only based on what I've experienced, I have seen some traction more recently. Parker, have you got a build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a moment where there is an opportunity for pharma to repair their reputation with the public, and honestly, I think sometimes it's surprising that pharma do have poor reputation with the public, given that most people in cancer research and cardiovascular research actually do work in pharma, and you do so much human good. But I mean, things like, as Ian will know, AstraZeneca pausing the trial today, I think shows that pharma are still being responsible with kind of regulation and approvals and safety, and not coming under political pressure to rush vaccines to market. So that's the kind of thing which I think is very credibility building. I think there's an opportunity kind of moving away from COVID. I think quite a few pharma companies are now beginning to embrace early detection, the early detection agenda, which I think is, that is going to be very a kind of really important kind of signal of moral compass, because the early detection agenda can be kind of misaligned with the interests of therapeutics, because in particular in cancer, if you detect cancer early, there's a lot less therapy, more surgery and radiotherapy at the margins, and less therapy. But we are seeing companies again like AstraZeneca and Novartis who are getting really serious about early detection, beginning to talk about investing there and partnering with ED diagnostic companies. So I mean, that's really encouraging to see, and I think that's the kind of thing that will demonstrate to public that we're reliant. So I think there's and one area that I think that can also be improved is there's always been, I think, a rather strange tension between academic and pharmaceutical research. And one of the things we try to do at Genomics England is to drive collaboration between our academic users of our data and our industry users. And the different types of company bring very different things to bear on data. And I think we're beginning to see both sides play more nicely with each other in the data playground. And I think that is actually a really positive thing too.
Yeah. I often Zoe, just to build on that, and I think exactly as Parker said, I think that if you, just as a guide, the NHS long-term plan is a really good place to start when you look at, looking at a reduction of cardiovascular events, or you look at reduction of respiratory, or you look at dementia, and particularly those three are absolute NHS priorities, pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. There's no doubt about it. So I think if you can line up with those sort of things, and you can be seen to be supporting the NHS in those particular areas in particular, that is collaboration. You're helping them achieve their long-term plan.
Yeah, there are a few other sort of things which I think are always quite interesting. So I think it's very easy to focus on central government, on the policymakers. It's very easy to focus on the big teaching trusts, and with very good reason. They've got a lot of resource. There is already a lot of collaboration with academia and other sectors, and also they've got big populations, which is really attractive for all the reasons that we know. What you see, I think, again, looking at local NHS, is you do see a lot of really interesting innovation happening at the fringes. So these are organisations who actually just, again, out of sheer necessity, are having to completely rethink the way things go. So what we're starting to hear and see are like some sort of fairly small rural DGHs who are now really considering completely eradicating the distinction between primary, secondary and tertiary care, because actually that doesn't work anymore in a COVID world. And quite often these organisations are the early adopters of new technology, and also looking to industry for different types of input. So again, looking at some of the constraints that they're operating in, and sometimes they might be looking to pharma companies for additional resource or investment in sort of quotes for things like greater educational content and or greater access to other types of innovation, or indeed skills and experience. And there's one very notable example of a few years ago down in the West Country, where actually the biggest challenge they had was they had a real recruitment issue. They could not attract decent talent into their organisation. So they had a real talent problem at consultant level. So actually they sort of completely pivoted what they represented and became known as a real centre of excellence for innovation and technology. So therefore any entrepreneurially minded consultant was attracted to it for those reasons, because they were known for really putting their clinical leaders and giving them the space to be able to experiment with new partnerships and new technology. So to Ian, to your point about evidence of where shifts have occurred or suggestions, sometimes actually looking out on the fringes a little bit is where you'll see some really interesting work happening, and then building on those and then showing and evidencing the fact that by working with those and collaborating with those, you've been able to be part of that kind of transformation. That I think then you can pull that through into some of the larger organisations and into sort of work on that more nationally.
It's interesting, what you've described, some of it is just, doing things that we've been doing for many years, but doing them really well and integrating them. And that's why I see there's an element for digital in terms of being the glue that facilitates this. You can break down geographic boundaries, so you can bring in people from different, what would have been primary, and secondary care geographies and institutions together for a similar the same consultation. Why not? And then some of it is really cutting edge in terms of, really dependent on the latest research to be able to do that early detection or the personalized, going down the personalized medicine. But what I think the really interesting challenge as we go forwards is how do we do that at scale in a really integrated way, so that we're always operating at the kind of full skill set to address those efficiencies, the huge challenge of all those patients who are not going to get the care if we just try to that they need, if we try to just do more faster to catch up on the backlog.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put everybody on the spot if that's okay, and everybody meaning our panel. So Justine Aldridge has put something in the chat channel, which is interested to see what changes have been made at pace and a sort of an honest reflection on the value that's brought. And how that can be replicated and utilised. So I'm going to ask each of you, if that's all right, to have a think about the one change that you've seen that has really sort of brought new value or has really changed things. And also, if possible, if it's not too controversial, an example of where you think there's been a lot of talk about change, but actually how sustained is that, and is that truly going to happen? So that's, who wants to take that one first? It's quite, I've put you on the spot a bit. I'm going to go to Parker, if that's all right.
It is putting me on the spot. I can think of a positive example quite quickly. I know this actually got quite a lot of negative press, but the work that NHSX did with Palantir to pull together supply and demand data sets across the country to model things like PPE, ventilator supply, but also locum staff supply against demand by hospital unit was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I got to see the model up front and close and kind of working with the scenario planning. And seriously, I mean, if you'd given this job to McKinsey or BCG or someone like that in a non-crisis time and said, can you pull together a real-time supply and demand model of all of the human and non-human kind of assets required to cope with COVID? I mean, it would have been like a 3 or 4 year project, and they did it in 8 to 12 weeks. And it became the dashboard that Boris Johnson and the kind of Sage used to respond. So I mean, that was really amazing, and I really hope that it'll persist. I believe that they've said that it won't persist beyond COVID, but I hope that at least some of the system integration survives, so that we do have that kind of national view of kind of critical national data sets. So that was a very positive thing. I'm trying to think of anything. I mean, there were some miscalculations.
Let's stick with the positive.
I'm trying to think of something regretful.
Samuel, you're shifting in the seat, so I'm going to pick on you next.
Yeah, I'm shifting my seat. So I definitely, one of the things that I've been most amazed about, obviously, apart from clearly, how we've turned things around, from a clinical perspective, how, everyone's doubled down on managing COVID, but there's some really good examples of where expert committees have come together quickly to issue new guidance in certain therapy areas. So there's been nice rapid guidelines in a number of areas, as well as some other key societies putting forward guidance that is technically not in the guise of COVID. Of course, it's around COVID, but it's because of COVID to ensure that we protect our patients, but actually have really probably fast-tracked process, which I hope are here to stay. And I'll be a bit more specific. So severe asthma, as an example, a rapid, nice guideline was pulled together for managing severe asthma patients, and all of those patients would have otherwise, suddenly overnight became shielded patients and were therefore there at home. And actually, the group came together in a matter of weeks and these are the severe asthma networks and consultants around the country, and pulled together a guideline which ultimately fast-tracked access to biologics and care without the need to go through the full MDT process that would have otherwise been there before. And so really have speeded up care for their patients, as well as really quickly pivoted all of those patients who would have had to go into the hospital. Suddenly, actually, these patients are now being initiated at home. So working with pharma, but also the home care providers to ensure suddenly overnight, these patients all were getting their biologics in their home, which is outstanding. And so the issue of guidance and the speed in some areas that parts of the NHS were able to move at has been absolutely phenomenal. And I'd say the same for heart failure, a new guideline that came out for heart failure, which is extremely positive. Again, through COVID, but I think a lot of it will stay because it's kind of fast-tracked titration processes which would otherwise been there. I think if I do think of one other, I will think of dare I say, a negative. I think that, again, I can only really speak to my knowledge of the Novartis portfolio right now, but if we look at ophthalmology as an area, and it was one of the areas Graham referenced as well, it really didn't get back up and running very quickly at all. And in fact, it still is huge amounts of backlog. So I guess there's that element of inequality between some therapy areas have been real focus, like heart failure, severe asthma, to get these really great guidelines in place quickly, whereas others, it feels like ophthalmology, have been a bit slower to achieve that, and as a result, huge backlog for patients, unfortunately, and services to get back up and running. So I know there probably is no fix, because clearly not everyone can be treated equal, but that's definitely sort of a pro and con I've seen through this.
Excellent, thank you. And Graham, any?
Okay, so I think I would answer this by talking about video consultations, which have been a really interesting and mixed picture, to say the least. So I touched on it earlier, but essentially what is clear is that there has been an increase in video consultations when you look at what individual video consultation providers are delivering. That's not reflected in the official data, just doesn't get into this, as I mentioned earlier. But what's also clear is that some people have really got on with this and found it's worked for them. Others haven't. And then there's been a lot of noise around where it works and where it doesn't. So, for example, there's quite a long track record of some great work that has been done with mental health provision. And this goes back way beyond long before COVID. And there's been a lot of, I think providers have learned quite a lot about how to deliver that. And the key lessons, really, it's not just about the tech that allows you to do the video calls in the same way that we're doing that now. It's about all the support that goes with it, which is partly the support for the professionals to streamline the process so that it feels like a normal day of patients flowing in and out. And there's a lot of support, and I think personally I probably underestimated the extent to which this was needed across the service, just helping all the admin within the service be able to work with those systems. Some providers, some digital providers have really integrated that so that you then have automatic follow-on and there's triaging integrated into it and all the things around it to make it a really efficient and seamless mechanism to deliver care. Others have really struggled, and it's been this kind of bolt-on alternative. Now we just don't have, this is where the metrics really break down. I can infer things based on data that we've got, but we really don't have at least public access to metrics which will allow us to tell what's really working and what's not. And that's where I think we need to be, we need to make some real, we can make some real step changes and improvements. And also we need to be assessing what the user experience is. And by that, I mean both the staff who are using it and the patients. And we're not collecting that information. So there are some, great opportunities to bring all of this information together and learn and develop and iterate. And this is an area where you can move really quickly to improve the service. But we've got to collect the information at a systematic level. And at the moment, it's only happening with some providers. So missing an opportunity.
So I know we're nearly out of time, but I do have one negative that I really would love to just say.
You can't end us on a negative note.
I'll keep it very brief. I think what has been revealed by the COVID crisis is how over-dependent the UK is on research funding by charities. I mean, it is stunning that 52% of our clinical research, I'm not just talking about a bookish research, I'm also talking about clinical trial funding, is coming from charities, many of whom have very few months of reserves, and the fact that the entire sector can fall over because we're not running marathons anymore or shaking tins on the street. I think it's something that we really need to look at as a country, how dependent we are on a very large number of very small charities and a few big ones, like when I'm on the board of CRUK. It's just a kind of sign of lack of resilience, and I think we really need to review that after all of this, the crisis dies down.
Okay, so we have 1 minute left, and what I would like to is just put you all on the spot for one more time, which is, this is clearly a very big moment in healthcare in the midst of an enormous transformation program where we were shifting from shifting care into integrated systems. As if that wasn't going to be difficult enough, we were then lumped with COVID, which is now compounded on some of the issues that the NHS and the pressures that were already being placed. What would be the sort of one word or one sentence of advice that you would give to anyone who is working in communications or marketing in the environment at the moment? Do you want to kick off with that one, Sam? One sentence.
So mine is very quickly, is very fast, become an expert in the NHS and the systems and truly understand your customers, because if you do, then you'll be able to better collaborate and understand their needs.
Great, thank you. Graham?
We are still, sadly, governed by different incentives across the system. So basically align the incentives and make sure that everything flows for the patients.
Great, and Parker?
What was ZPB?
Your fiver, we'll bring the fiver in. Excellent.
Well, I can't obviously add to that, build on that one. That just leaves me to say thank you very much once again to Graham, Samuel, and to Parker for their input and their energy in all of this. Mike, thank you so much for hosting us and for helping pull this all together. And thanks to everybody who we can't see who has participated in this event. I think this is all being recorded, so I'm hoping that we will be able to share the video of this with people afterwards. Ian, I'm conscious there's another question from you there which we haven't answered, so perhaps we can follow up with you and try and answer that one offline. Thank you very much to everybody for coming along today, and Mike, I'll hand back over to you.
Well, I think as well as obviously thanking Samuel, Graham and Parker again, but also thank you to you, Zoe, for and your colleagues at ZPB for putting this together for a very enlightening discussion. And obviously thank you, as you said, Zoe, for everybody who's joined us today and watching, and for the questions we've had. Just also, our next shared experience session is on the 24th of September, and that's two journalists, the head of journalism and the news editor from the BMJ. So that's probably one worth joining into as well. And you can register for that on the HCA website. Otherwise, again, thank you, panel. Thank you, Zoe. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.